Yeah, so as folks probably know, I live in the Southwest, down in Guestwick, and I spend a lot of time out in the field, especially in areas where we had the 2023 wildfire season. Just because I find, I mean, everyone knows that the Swains Bog area is one of the most interesting areas to botanize in Nova Scotia. That's part of the draw, but also I've been really interested to track how the ecotone is responding to recovery from the fire. I think it's really interesting to live in an area where I can just drive, for a few minutes and watch succession in action. And my background is in conservation horticulture, so sort of over this past field season, I developed a bit of a special interest in some of those plants, which are um, part of the first succession plants that many of you folks have probably visited the Southwest to see on your own, like northern cranesbill, because I think they're really interesting species for us as surveyors and observers of the natural world to like interpret the landscape, and also as gardeners as very interesting natural alternatives to some of the items you see really regularly in urban gardens like bloody cranesbill or Geranium macrorhizum, like the hardy geraniums that mostly come from subarctic Europe. Um, we have our own geraniums. We just have to kind of roll with some of the stranger things they need to germinate, which that's kind of what I was planning on talking about. Um, these are the two species that I was referring to, folks. On one side, you have Geranium bicknelli, which is the northern cranesbill, a fire-adapted native geranium, biennial native geranium. And on the other side, you have Lechea intermedia, which is a plant in the Crustaceae, related to the frostweed or frost rose, folks may know from the sand barrens in the valley, which is a species of special concern. This is how it grows, Geranium bicknelli, I should say, naturally. It has a prostrate habit. You can see it's this is in Shelburne, actually along the Swains Bog Road Trail. Naturally, it sort of falls over like this, and the texture of the plant is very delicate. Pieces of it break off very, very readily, and that's part of its adaptation strategy. This species needs the high temperatures of a wildfire in order to reach peak germination, but it also needs the fire, like many fire-adapted species, to wipe out its competition. And then in the years following its germination event, it presents itself at its most vibrant. Generally, you get about 3 years of very, very strong propagation from fire adapted species where the seeds that the first successional individuals produce, they happen to be a little bit less sensitive to temperature. They germinate on their own without the intercession of fire. And the plant itself often has strategies to propagate itself vegetatively. So in this case, the geranium falls apart, and each piece that kind of falls off of the plant has a chance to root before the winter sets in, and then it will propagate itself in the substrate. It will root by itself. This is the other plant I wanted to talk about, Lechea intermedia. This is a bit less showy, but I really like it as a horticultural selection. And it stands out really only after the fire has swept through. Normally you see it like the frostweed, Canada frostweed in the valley. You see it hanging out with these really alien looking tiny flowers above heaths like wild blueberry or bearberry. And it's honestly very, very attractive as a border plant, especially along trail. And again, what it needs is for its companion and competition to get wiped out by fire. Often heaths come back really readily from fire from their own root adaptation. And so you get this two-layered effect of the pinweed, that's the common name for this plant, hanging out just over the heath, putting on kind of a really interesting show. But I think what interests me most about it is that it has these two very distinct forms. It's a little bit like some of the more, I guess, finicky plants to key out in Nova Scotia, where once you start seeing the differences, it's very difficult to stop seeing them. But as I mentioned in this slide, the inland form tends to have very small seed pods and this is very prostrate basal rosette of leaves, which I'll show on the next slide. The coastal form, also known as Juniperina, variety Juniperina, tends to be very compact with an extremely almost conifer-like basal rosette and really big seed pods. Here, you can actually see on the left-hand side, this is an ID'd specimen from a site in New Brunswick, rather, that's quite well known for having this particular variety in a large population, Cushy-Buac. And these are my attempt at macro photos of the seeds at the very top. I'm going to drop, after my talk, I'll drop a little link in the chat to this article, which was produced by the Medway Community Forest Cooperative. I don't expect you to read all of that. The kind of summary is that pinweed is a really interesting specimen because it can often help you read a landscape and its susceptibility to fire. You have these two forms, so you can use variety Juniperina to help you recognize a coastal heathland that has that undergoes or can undergo periodic fire. Even after that piece of land might have been changed or regenerated by landowners or by just your normal the succession of the landscape. And you can use the plant itself and its kind of its prevalence to tell you whether or not a piece of land in general has a tendency to burn, whether you're a property owner or just a surveyor. In fact, folks who have spotted this plant may know that it's really common beside old timber lanes and timber trails, especially inland and especially around Kujik, because Nova Scotia in the early colonial period suffered from these massive province-wide forest fires that would knock down huge tracts of forest. They're responsible for the destruction of a lot of what we would now call old growth forest, and from our modern perspective, looking back, that it had a chance to evolve and join us in our contemporary perspective. And so often you find pinweed in the strangest places in the middle of nowhere in inland Nova Scotia on hikes, because that piece of land you're on suffered from a massive historical fire. So this is also kind of a key to some of Nova Scotia's history with non-ecologically regenerative forestry practices. Here I'm kind of demonstrating that one of those ways to recognize the two varieties, Juniperina versus intermedia. On the right-hand side, that is that's definitely intermedia. I had a friend who works in conservation in Massachusetts help me identify it. One of the really classic ways as well to identify variety intermedia is that prostrate habit also tends to root. So those long fronds will drip down onto the road or into its substrate, root from their internodes, and then the plant will propagate outwards from that basal rosette vegetatively, whereas variety Juniperina tends to kind of pile up in this almost conifer-like fashion, doesn't root from its basal rosette, and tends to kind of keep to itself in this dwarfed habit, just produce flowering fronds straight up from that root ball. Sorry about that, guys. Um, I again really really like this plant as a horticultural as a decorative possibility in our garden. In my opinion, the only frustrating thing about it is that to get really strong germination from its seed, you need to kind of deal with its need for heat. Other than that, it produces these like really interesting flower and leaf arrangements, which they almost make me think of like the holidays in late summer. It's got this red and green thing going on, holly-like habit, which I find really interesting for native plant gardening. And this is, again, my attempt at a macro shot of Geranium bicknelli, trying to show off its own seed pods here. And how I'm going to use Geranium bicknelli as an easy way to kind of demonstrate how you folks, if you're out surveying and you spot some of these plants, how you might take some of the seeds back home and then reintroduce them to your own garden. Because it's about as easy as making a cup of tea. So here you can see the bill of the crane on the left hand side, and then on the right hand side, that bill dried and prepared for treatment. It's about as easy as dumping the seed into a cup where you might have some hot water and exposing them to that hot temperature for about 10 minutes. That's about all you need to produce really large amounts of these otherwise finicky plants is just hot water. And because of that one sort of aspect, they've mostly been disqualified from sort of the horticultural world. That's seen as too big a barrier for most gardeners. And I think we're above that. I think that we can use this plant to great effect in place of some of the more invasive geraniums we might otherwise want in our garden. And we're also, in that sense, kind of bringing this plant into our urban terrain as like a figurehead or showcase of some of the regeneration that's taking place across the landscape post the 2023 wildfire season. Here, this is a classic spot to go and see Lechea intermedia of the Juniperina variety at a fairly well-known spot on Nature Trust land off of Trifry Road down here in the southwest. The field on the right-hand side is actually historically a blueberry field that the owner burned quite thoroughly. And so the forest in behind that blueberry field has also occasionally suffered some pretty big burns. And so you can walk the trail that you see my dog on the right hand side out past into the forest itself and see kind of this colony of pinweed that I don't think you'll see as dense a colony anywhere else in Nova Scotia. It's almost difficult to walk through. You can hear the seeds sprinkling off your boots as you push through it. And it kind of showcases how dense it can be, possibly as an ornamental planting, but also that if you're walking around a property that you're either surveying or considering buying and you see such a dense colony of this plant, you might consider looking for other fire-adapted species, start doing some ecosystem delineation of sort of coastal heath barrens that undergo periodic fire. It can also be a sign that you should be looking for other fire-adapted species of the Atlantic coastal plains in that area. Here you can see when I spotted pinweed in a particular site near Bacaro, I started trying to put my botanizing eyes on a little bit more carefully for sand plains and barren plants. On the left-hand side, I'm fairly certain this is Bicknell's flax, but I obviously didn't catch it in flower. The yellow flower would have been really diagnostic. I have to go back and look a little bit more closely because that would be a first observation for Nova Scotia, I think. And on the right-hand side, I'm fairly certain this is Diphasiastrum alpinum, which is a dendrolycopodium species. I need to ID it properly under a microscope, but it's a sort of ground cedar lycopod, which also is fire adapted, also needs its spores to be exposed in the soil column by fire in order to germinate properly. So these plants that I was mentioning, both bicknells, geranium, the northern cranesbill, and pinweed, Lechea intermedia, can be signs that you should either return to a site or look a little bit more closely at a site to see if fire adapted species might be kind of on the menu as a possible botanizing item. And hopefully this is tempting some of you to make a few more trips down to the southwest for a closer look at the areas that burned around Shelburne and Bucaro, because I think we're going to see more and more interesting things, assuming we don't get another huge wildfire season as succession continues.